Hey everybody, welcome back. Our next speaker is Daniel Sheehan. Yeah, we can do that. I go back with Daniel to 1994 when I first invited him to present to the International UFO Congress. And at that time, one of the main reasons that we invited him was that he had just had a chance, well, not just, but he had had a chance to review all of the classified sections of Project Blue Book. Now, this is something in the myth, in the ether, that is talked about often, but you never find anybody that has actually seen it, read it, digested it, knows what's in it. And where do you think he actually had the chance to review these documents? At the Vatican. Yeah, really. Danny Sheehan is a constitutional and public interest lawyer, public speaker, and educator. Over the last 45 years, he has participated in numerous legal cases of public interest, including the Pentagon Papers case, the Watergate break-in case, the Karen Silkwood case, the Iran-Contra scandal, and others. He established the Christic Institute and the Romero Institute. He has also spoken publicly about UFOs and alien visitation. Currently, he is chief counsel of the Romero Institute. He has also published The People's Advocate, a memoir, in 2013, and is also working on a book on recent theories of the John F. Kennedy assassination. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a brilliant man of extraordinary intellect coming to share with us today. But think about his foundation. He is a man that knows we're not alone. He knows the universe is teeming with other life. And foundation stone, guys. He knows that all of this universe of teeming life, including us, humanity, is not here by accident. Think about that. So when you have a man of this kind of intellect, but a man with heart and love for justice and humanity, championing our causes, how extraordinary is that? Please welcome Danny Sheehan.
I've been officially involved in exploring this issue of the existence of extraterrestrial intelligence elsewhere in the universe and its relationship to our human consciousness ever since basically 39 years ago this week, back in November of 1976, in mid-November, when I was contacted by Marcia Smith, the director of the Congressional Research Services Science and Technology Division, in my capacity as Chief Counsel for the United States Jesuit Order at their headquarters in Washington, D.C., in their National Social Ministry Office. Marcia contacted me and informed me that she had been asked by President Carter, the newly elected president as of November 4th of 1976, to undertake a major set of reports, two reports from the Congressional Research Service to the President. The first on the potential existence of extraterrestrial intelligence elsewhere in the universe, and a second report on this phenomenon of UFOs and what the evidence was to support those. I was called by Marcia as a result of kind of an interesting event that I happened to, a week earlier, I was having dinner with Rosemary Chalk, who is the executive secretary of the National Academy of Sciences in Washington, D.C. And at the end of dinner, she started talking about the fact that, gee, you've been involved in all of these big, huge cases, the Pentagon Papers case and the Watergate burglary case and all of these others that Bob was gracious enough to mention. You must have always wanted to be a lawyer. You're such a natural lawyer. And I said, no, actually, I wanted to be an astronaut. And she said, really, why is that? And I said, well, because I was so interested in this issue of extraterrestrial intelligence, and I wanted to get a chance to go out there and meet these people. And she said, gee, this is really strange. She said, one of my best friends, Marcia Smith, who is the head of the Science and Technology Division of the Congressional Research Service, has just been contacted by the Office of the President and has been asked to prepare these two major studies for the President on extraterrestrial intelligence and the UFO phenomenon. Would you be willing to talk with her about this? So I said I would, and Marcia called me, and we had lunch, and she asked if I, in my capacity as Chief Counsel for the United States Jesuit Order there at the Washington headquarters, would be willing to contact the Vatican and see if the Vatican would be willing to grant me access to the classified portions of the Vatican Library dealing with extraterrestrial intelligence and the UFO phenomenon. And so I contacted my superiors at Jesuit headquarters, Father Bill Davis and others, and asked if I could get permission to make that request, and they said yes. And so I contacted the Jesuit priest who was the head of the director of the Vatican Library and asked if I could get permission to get access to the library. Much to my surprise, he said no. And so I wrote him back a second letter saying, I must not have made myself clear enough here. Don't you realize who we are here at the headquarters, and that President Carter, President-elect Carter, has asked that we have these access to this, and they still said no. So I reported this to Marcia Smith, and Marcia was kind enough to have me still become special counsel to the research investigation that they were going to be doing. And it was in that capacity that I was contacted by Marcia and asked if I would go with a number of the astronauts to visit Congress, because Congress here in 1977 had decided to cut in half the budget for the SETI program, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, California. And they were terribly distressed about this, and wanted to know if I, from the Jesuit headquarters, would be willing to go with the astronauts around to talk to the individual congresspeople to try to get them to put that other half of the budget back in, which I did. And it turns out that Congress did put the other half of the budget back in. So the scientists at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory at SETI were extremely happy and invited me to come to Pasadena from Washington, D.C., and present to them a 3-hour closed-door seminar on the theological implications of contact with an extraterrestrial civilization. In preparation for doing that, I asked Marcia Smith she said, what type of documentation would you like to have to help you prepare for that? I said, I would like to be given access to the classified portions of Project Blue Book, which was, as most of you know, the classified investigation that the United States Air Force conducted into the existence of UFOs. And much to our pleasant surprise, the Air Force said yes. And so I was given access to the classified portions of Project Blue Book. Many of you have heard that story before, so I won't go into great detail about it. But the bottom line is that I was given access to these documents, and in those documents I was able to see photographs of what were indisputably UFO vehicles. And because of that, I then went to I made the presentation to the scientists at SETI. But as Chief Counsel of the United States Jesuit Order, I then approached the other 52 offices of the other major religious denominations in the United States back in 1978, and I asked them to set up a task force to start looking into the philosophical and theological implications of our contact with extraterrestrial civilizations, because I had gotten the final report in from the research that was being done by the Congressional Research Service, and they had come to the conclusion that it was over 95% likely that there were from 2 to 6 other highly intelligent, highly technologically developed, but distinctly non-human civilizations just here in our Milky Way galaxy. And they presented this to the president, Jimmy Carter. And because of that finding, I felt moved to go to the other religious denominations and ask them to set up this special task force. They said no, that they didn't believe that that was an appropriate thing to do, or at least an adequate priority on their part. But prior to that set of experiences back in 1976 and 1977, I, like virtually everybody else here in this room here today, had been fascinated by this issue. I had become fascinated by the time I was 5 years old with the discovery of stars. I discovered sitting out in the lawn of my house when I was 5 years old, when I was allowed one evening to watch the stars come out. I was kind of flabbergasted by the fact that these stars were actually other suns. And so I rather immediately assumed that these other suns had planets around them, and that on some of these planets that there were other beings, other people. And so I was extremely fascinated by that. And I decided that actually what happened is I had this kind of conceptual response to the whole thing, because as I would sit out and watch these stars out in the sky at night and watch them pulsing out in the distance, I was completely struck by how absurd it was, the kind of things that we were doing down here on our planet. This was back in 1950 when I was 5 years old. And, here we were every day, in this major nuclear confrontation with the Soviet Union, the potential for which was blowing up the entire planet and destroying our entire species, because we had drawn these artificial boundaries in the soil and said that, you people have to be on this side of those lines and we're on these other side. And I thought that was preposterous. In light of the existence of this other realm of civilizations, watching us and what we were doing. And at that time, we had this extraordinarily silly invasion going on of the Korean Peninsula, and a huge fight going on in the Korean War of we, human family, using our ingenuity, our technological ingenuity, to figure out how to dig into the earth and dig up minerals and melt them down and form them into bullets and explosives to make weapons to try to shoot hot lead into each other's bodies, over a debate about these boundaries. And as I said, it was a conceptual response that I was having to this experience of the stars and the existence of other extraterrestrial intelligence, and the stark a juxtaposition between that kind of awesome reality and this rather extraordinary primitive type of conduct that we were engaged in here on our planet. I had then I heard about UFOs, and I said, "Wow, this is great! Look, it turns out that some of these beings are actually coming here right now, and that people are seeing these lights in the sky, and they're actually getting to see some of these vehicles. Once in a rare occasion, they actually get photographs of these." And so I said, this is fabulous. So I began following, like everybody here in the room, began following the details of these various sightings, trying to see how good the pictures were that they were getting of these vehicles. And then we began to hear about the direct contact that some individual people were having. Betty and Barney Hill, right? That I'm old enough to remember that happening, and being all of a sudden told by John Fuller in his book, The Incident at Exeter, about this extraordinary contact that they had, in which Betty Hill actually got to converse telepathically with one of these beings, asking them where they were and what they were doing here, etc. So I was completely fascinated by this. So I would consistently nag my mother to get her to let me go to all these science fiction movies back in the 50s, and I was horrified by this peculiar treatment that was being given to this wonderful issue, in such things as War of the Worlds and Invaders from Mars and It Came from Outer Space, and all these 1950s science fiction films that had all of these terrible beings coming here threatening us. But then I began to become fascinated, because every once in a while there was one of these science fiction movies that was much more thoughtful and reflective, like the Day the Earth Stood Still, that actually pointed out that the people that were causing the problem between us and the extraterrestrial beings was us. And that struck me as much more reasonable to perceive the thing in that manner. And there were other movies such as This Island Earth and Conquest of Space, where we began to see feathered into these horror movies a whole bunch of positive movies about how wonderful this is, what a terrific idea this is to go out into space and establish contact with other beings and learn what they've discovered. And so I had decided that I was going to be an astronomer. And so that was my, when I was in the first grade, second grade, and they would say, "What is it you want to be?" And I would say, "I want to be an astronomer." And then I discovered that we didn't have the technology really to even be able to tell that there were even any other planets at that time. All we could see is the stars, and I'd have to sit around in this kind of cold observatory and watch all these little pricks of light and take in spectral light from them and look through computers. I said, that's not very exciting. So I decided that I'd be an astronaut. And so that's what I had decided I was going to be. But some of you have heard that story when I applied to the United States Air Force Academy and was one of the top candidates from New York State. And I went to be interviewed by Senator Jacob Javits, one of the United States senators from New York, to get the senatorial appointment to the Air Force Academy. And when he asked me why I wanted to go to the Air Force Academy, I told him that I wanted to become an astronaut. And he said, "Well, why do you want to become an astronaut?" And I said, "Well, because I think this is terribly exciting. I want to get to go out and meet these other beings that exist out in the universe." And there was this big dead silence. And he looked up and he said, So you actually think there are other beings and other planets out in the universe?" And I said, "Well, certainly, so do you. Obviously, you're a United States senator. You're not stupid." Well, anyway, it turns out that, actually, he was quite surprised by that response from an 18-year-old kid from the North Woods of New York. And so he admitted to me, actually, that he'd already given the appointment to someone else, actually the son of one of his major financial contributors. And so I was kind of thunderstruck by this. He offered me the appointment to Annapolis, to the Naval Academy. And I said, "I'm not into boats. I'm into planes and flying and getting to be an astronaut." But anyway, the bottom line is that I realized that the system wasn't quite working right. That this kind of a rather low consciousness appointment of somebody else to my position at the Air Force Academy just because his father was a major contributor to Javits' campaign, I thought the system wasn't quite working correctly. And so I figured it was a little bit out of tune. So what I would do is I would take a little detour and I would become an attorney. And I would spend a little while getting the system back into tune. And then I would get back to being an astronaut and getting to go into space. Well, as it turned out, I discovered in my legal practice that the system wasn't just a little bit out of tune. It turns out that it was playing an entirely different song than we'd been taught in high school social studies classes. And so I had to spend overlong in this period of being an attorney. And I got involved in a lot of these cases. And that's how I happened to be there at the Jesuit National Headquarters in 1976 when President Carter was elected and was invited to participate in this discussion. So actually, that's why I was involved in this when, in fact, John Mack, the head of the Department of Clinical Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, wrote a book called Abductions, Human Contact with Aliens, and he was dragged up in front of a special ad hoc faculty committee at Harvard University in 1994 and was being kind of pilloried by his peers at Harvard University for having the gall to actually suggest that people were actually having direct contacts with extraterrestrial beings. And as a 1967 graduate of Harvard College, by that time, in 1970 graduate of Harvard Law School, and a master's degree candidate, and then a PhD candidate at the Harvard Divinity School in comparative social ethics, I was asked by John Mack to represent him in front of the faculty committee as his attorney. And it was in that context that John and I went to meet with and spent an entire day with Lawrence Rockefeller. And Lawrence Rockefeller, it turns out, as he confided to us, one of his best friends, the actual Prince of Liechtenstein. I guess if you're a Rockefeller, you kind of have those as your best friends. His friend, who was the Prince of Liechtenstein, had actually seen a UFO sitting on the ground, full-scale UFO, and had told this to Lawrence Rockefeller. So Lawrence had become convinced that these existed and was very interested in this, so he agreed to provide whatever funding was necessary for Dr. John Mack and I to present what was in effect a grand rounds to the Harvard Medical School and to the entire Harvard University faculty on this issue of the existence of extraterrestrial intelligence and the UFO phenomenon. So I, in that context, then went before the faculty committee at Harvard and told them that we were prepared to present this grand rounds to them on this issue and bring before them, general officers, the United States Air Force, police officers, mayors of towns, other, quote, respectable people within the established order to present to them the evidence of this. And it was in that context that I got to meet virtually all of the major illuminaries in this field of the UFOs and extraterrestrial intelligence. I got to meet Bud Hopkins and, on the other hand, David Jacobs and Stan Friedman and Dr. Stephen Greer and Linda Moulton Howe, Nick Pope, who will be here, Jaime Maussan, who will be here today, Whitley Striebler, Bob Woods, Wendell Stevens, Donald Ware, a lot of these people that probably only a handful of us here in this room actually have ever met. Bob, myself, and a few others, not young people who are still young and beautiful like Paula, but the older kind of gray hairs of us among here actually knew these people. And so that I was very fortunate in that. And when we made this offer of this presentation to the faculty at Harvard University, the legal counsel for Harvard University leapt to her feet and said, "Absolutely not. We're not going to allow these hearings to be turned into some sort of a circus." And so I got John, and we got up and walked out. And I said, "When you're ready to actually listen to this subject, we'll come back. But until then, we'll wait to hear from you." And so we left. They finally wrote a letter of apology to John and said that there was a misunderstanding. They were just trying to get him to share his information with them, which was a huge fat lie. But they basically apologized to him and stopped their inquiries. And John then set up a thing called the Project for Extraordinary Research, Extraordinary Experience Research, right next to Harvard University. And there we began to get to talk with people who had had these direct experiences from all around the world. They were coming in and meeting with John, and John was working with them. And I had the great privilege of getting to sit in sessions with hundreds of these different people. And so I began to understand that this experience had a whole other dimension to it. It wasn't just that simple beings from another star system were traveling here to our planet and visiting people. Turns out that this phenomenon was accompanied by a whole set of kind of effects upon the consciousness of the people that were having these experiences. It began to elevate their consciousness. They began to have a much broader vision of the universe and our relative role in it. They began to talk with these other beings about the bizarre conduct of our human family here on the planet. These beings seemed to be extremely concerned about a number of different issues, one of which, of course, was the development of thermonuclear weapons, the potential for destroying all life on our planet. And they were also terribly concerned about the pollution of the planet, of our emitting waste materials into the environment, pumping sludge out of our factories into the waterways, pumping the chemicals into the atmosphere, and poisoning our entire environment, and pillaging the resources to be constantly trying to develop and make more products for people all the time. And so that they would share this concern with some of the beings, or the beings would share this concern with the humans that were being contacted. So there began to develop inside the entire ET UFO community this kind of rising consciousness about there being this other dimension to the ET contact experience. Then we began to get reports of these beings passing through walls and dematerializing beings and moving them up into their craft and traveling faster than the speed of light and having interesting discussions with them about reincarnation and other much higher perspectives on consciousness than our human family normally has. And so I began to have these discussions with people in the UFO community. And I was invited in 1994 by Bob to come to the International UFO Congress and to report on this set of experiences with Dr. John Mack, the status of his case, how the Project for Extraordinary Experience Research was going. So I began to have this relationship with people at the International UFO Congress, and I was invited to MUFON to make presentations to them about this subject for the most part. Finally, there came a point in time when Bob Brown and Terry asked me to come to the International UFO Congress here in Laughlin and make a presentation about what my particular views were on this issue of extraterrestrial intelligence and the UFO phenomenon. And in that presentation that I made in the year 2000, I explained that it became very clear to me after a full decade almost in this field that the response that people had to an encounter, either with a UFO vehicle, anything more than just kind of a distant light in the sky, but when they actually encountered a UFO vehicle that was indisputably that, or that they had an encounter with an extraterrestrial being, that the actual response that the people had to that was very much a function of the worldview that particular human being adhered to. And so what I did in that year 2000 presentation at the International UFO Congress, I presented the range of human worldviews that I had come to learn about at Harvard Divinity School that explains that there is an entire spectrum of human worldviews we tend to hear about these different worldviews almost exclusively in the context of politics. That we hear that there are authoritarians on the extreme right wing, and there are reactionaries that are just a little bit to the left of them. Then there are conservatives, then there are moderates, and there are liberals, and there are progressives, and then there are people who are kind of utopianists. And that we hear these terms bantered about by journalists and others in these discussions, these panels, but nobody ever really explains what it is that causes a person to be one or another of these things. And so what I did in that initial presentation in the year 2000, I set forth a rather too academic kind of explanation of what the predicates are of these different worldviews, what it is that causes a person to be an adherent to one or another of these worldviews. And I won't go into all the great details of that, but you can get a copy of that. Year 2000 International UFO Congress presentation, and you'll see what the breakdown is. That actually, very briefly, that it turns out that one's worldview is really a function of the conclusion that you come to with regard to 4 basic pillar questions. The first is, how do you believe the universe actually came into being? Or do you believe that the physical universe has always been here? Do you believe that it all just started with a big bang and has been sort of evolving ever since that and is expanding out from the center of the big bang? Or do you believe that it has always existed and that it expands out and then stops and then contracts and then has another big bang and expands again? This kind of repetitive oscillation of the universe. What is your cosmological belief about that? The second of the 4 major pillar questions is what they call your teleological belief. And that is, how do you believe the universe is unfolding? Do you think the universe is unfolding toward some specific ultimate state of perfection? Or do you believe that it is ultimately just disintegrating into its ultimate constituent parts of inchoate quantum fields, which will eventually just dissipate into the universe? What is your teleological set of assumptions about whether or not there's any kind of inherent meaning or purpose in the actual unfolding of the universe? And the third of the 4 pillar questions is the ontological question they refer to in philosophy. That is simply, it's a big word for the issue of consciousness. What do you believe about how consciousness has come into existence in an otherwise completely material universe of rocks and stars and stardust, etc.? How did this become conscious? Because we're totally cognizant of the fact that we're conscious, walking around up here, riding around behind our eyeballs here, looking out into the world and reflecting upon things. We know that we're conscious. We know that differing life forms from animals and plants and dogs and cats have their own kind of consciousness. Where did this come from? And what is the nature of it? What is its relationship to matter in the universe, mass and energy? What's the relationship of our consciousness to that? Then there's the fourth and the final of the pillar questions, which is what they call the epistemological question. And that's just another great big word for the question of what type of means do we have at our disposal as human beings by means of which we can possibly answer cosmic questions like that. Are we confined to simply the data that we can take in through our 5 senses of our being able to see and hear and taste and touch and smell? Is that the only mechanism we have by means of taking data in and processing it through our intellect? Even just simply amplifying those particular senses with telescopes and microscopes and amplifiers, etc., but still confined basically to just the exercise of our 5 physical senses? Or do we believe that there may be some other faculties that we possess? A 6th faculty, for example, which we refer to as extrasensory perception. There's this entire discussion going on about whether or not we have another faculty that is evolving in our human family, similar to sight and hearing and taste and touch and smell. And it's another mechanism by means of which we can actually discern existent data and take it into our brains and process it. That is the epistemological question. And what one discovers is that if a person answers all four of those fundamental pillar questions, the cosmological question, the teleological question, the ontological question, and the epistemological question, just all big names for what I've identified them to be. If you answer all four of those questions in a way that is completely internally and self-referentially consistent one with another, it ends up generating a particular mode of ethical analysis. Because simply put, every person will analyze a given situation that they encounter predicated upon what they assume to be the nature of reality. And it's kind of more ultimate in fundamental forms. And so there's nothing extraordinary about that, if you think clearly enough about it, is that anybody is going to analyze a situation and try to determine what to do about it, predicated upon what they believe is going on to context that event. So that's the mode of ethical reasoning that actually, if you apply a consistent and internally self-referentially consistent mode of ethical reasoning to all of the major issues that confront one in their normal life situation, you will come up with a full philosophy. That's where philosophies come from. That's why every single one of these major worldviews that I've identified only by their political theory, every single one of them has its own generic and distinct philosophy. You know, that's why you hear all these about these philosophers of Hegel and Nietzsche, and the others, Jung, and you hear about all these different philosophers. That's why they have different philosophies, is because they answer these fundamental pillar questions in a different way. Okay, so that was the nature of the discussion that we started with back in the year 2000, laying out the fact that I believed that people who were, for example, an authoritarian, when they encounter a UFO experience, they immediately think about in terms of how it is they can get access to this information so they can continue being an authoritarian, and that they can get access to the technology and use it for themselves to be able to dominate and completely control the world. That's their response to it. There's an old Sufi saying that when a pickpocket meets a saint, all he sees are his pockets. And so that when an authoritarian has an encounter with a UFO or an extraterrestrial being, their immediate response is just to try to figure out how to get information from them to be able to continue being an authoritarian. Now, on the other hand, you step in one step to the left and you get a reactionary. And a reactionary identifies themselves totally in terms of the degree of success that they have in overcoming some ultimate adversary. It's a classic dynamic. It's a dialectical dynamic, a dualistic dynamic. And so therefore, when they encounter a UFO or an extraterrestrial being, what they immediately try to think in terms of is how to ultimately vanquish that ultimate other. That how do we get access to the technology so we can vanquish them, so that we can succeed in defeating them. They feel constantly threatened by the existence of some ultimate other. And it progresses all the way on through to the point where you get to the other extreme. You get to the other extreme of the utopians. When they encounter an extraterrestrial being or a UFO, they immediately go, "Oh, this is absolutely fantastic. You know, they've come here to help us. They're our star brothers. They're our sisters and brothers from elsewhere. They're going to be sharing all their technology. We'll figure out how to solve our global climate change. They'll be able to cure cancer, and they will actually teach us what God is all about. They may even actually be God. They may have actually created us. They may have engaged in DNA engineering, and made us. We all may be just their creations, and they're our God. So that what I'm saying is that I explained at that time in the year 2000 that our response to this experience, each of us, is a function of our worldview, which is a function of our beliefs with regard to these four major pillar questions. And I hasten to point out that the reason why your answers to those four pillar questions is so important is because nobody can prove definitively, at least at this point in our history, what the answers to those are. So the reality is that everybody has to be able to make some sort of intuitive judgment about what their answer is going to be to those questions. And that nobody's going to be able to come in and say, you're completely wrong, here, let me show you the evidence that shows you that I'm dispositively correct on that. So the reality is that our human family is still in a situation where people are required to make intuitive judgments about the answers to those four pillar questions, and therefore their mode of ethical reasoning that they bring to the analysis of any given situation, which underlies the formation of their own philosophy, is all intuitive. And so all of the arguments they make about letting me show you the facts, the scientific facts, etc., they're all basically just rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. You know, that they don't have any underlying absolute verification of their position at all. All they can show is that if you start with a certain set of presumptions, we can show you that that a certain answer would follow from that. But they do not explain why they make those assumptions. So that was the beginning of this discussion that we had. And then in the year 2001, I was fortunate enough to be invited to be legal counsel to the Disclosure Project in Washington, D.C. That Dr. Stephen Greer and a number of us, we brought together 100 different experiencers and government agents that had inside information about the UFO issue and the ET issue, et cetera. And I was given the great privilege of vetting all of these particular potential witnesses, just as though we were going to be having a trial. And we selected 21 of the major people, and we presented them at the National Press Club to all of the staff members of the United States Congress. And we presented these people, like the chief investigator for the Federal Aviation Agency, U.S. military officers from the rank of general officers in the United States Air Force, to colonels, to captains such as Bob Salas, and others that had had these direct experiences. And so I was very fortunate, again, to get to meet additional people that were involved in this area. And then on the 20th anniversary of the International UFO Congress, I was privileged to have Bob invite me to make an additional presentation about this issue. And in that particular presentation, I pointed out that I believed that the way in which our United States government and the other governments of the world and the United Nations are going to go about revealing the existence of other extraterrestrial civilizations is not by coming clean and acknowledging that, for example, the vehicles were captured at Roswell back in 1947 in July, and that they've been lying to us the entire time, and that they've been suppressing people that are witnesses and punishing people and destroying their entire livelihoods who attempt to simply tell people the truth. They're not going to do that. That what they're going to do is they're going to utilize the fact that we have now put these major new space telescopes up. Originally the Hubble, then the Kepler, in the Planck space telescope. We're going to be putting up the James Webb telescope in 2018. What they're going to be doing is they're going to be following a process. I pointed out at the 20th anniversary discussion of this, what they're going to be doing is they're going to be just slowly feathering in information. They're going to start saying, oh, what do you know? We've discovered that there are planets. I knew that when I was 5 years old, but they didn't, because they were following the fourth paradigm, scientific logical positivist worldview, where they don't acknowledge anything to even exist unless they can taste it, touch it, smell it, weigh it, measure it. If they can't do that with their five senses, they don't simply say, well, we haven't determined whether that is true or not. They simply say it isn't true. That the only thing that's true is that in that small circle of information that they can taste and touch and smell and weigh. And so that they, up until 15 years ago, they denied that we could actually say there were planets anywhere else. That we were potentially the only planet in the entire universe. That's what they would say. But what they're going to be doing, I pointed out in that 20th anniversary International UFO Congress gathering, was that I believe that what they're first going to be doing is saying, oh, lo and behold, we've discovered that there are planets. Then they're going to start saying, oh, we've discovered with the spectroscopes that we are taking light in from the reflection of those planets, we're going to be able to say that, oh, lo and behold, it appears that there's actually water on those other planets. Then they're going to start saying, oh, we've begun to detect information that indicates that in that water on other planets, there seems to be some form of microscopic life. Now, that's not going to cause everybody to run out and start driving around the block and honking their horns. You know, they're going to go, oh, they've discovered some bacteria, you know, in the deep sea of some far distant planet, or even a moon around Jupiter. That's not going to be the breaking point. But what they're going to be doing then is they're going to start pointing out that then they've discovered yet another planet that appears to have life that is a little bit more sophisticated, basic vegetable life in the seas. And then they're going to find another planet that seems to have some sort of minor life that's able to move around, like amoebas and stuff, and moving around, and then minor fish. And they're eventually going to go through this process, one step at a time, one planet at a time, getting our people on our planet, our human family, acclimated step by step to the fact that they're discovering the life process elsewhere in the universe, step by step. That they're eventually going to come to the point of acknowledging that they've encountered some type of extraordinarily primitive primate life, such as Australopithecus or other ape forms, etc. And then people are going. The light's going to start coming on, and people are going to go, well, "Holy mackerel!" You know, if they're discovering those, and we think we evolved up out of those, you know, there must be other life like humans around. And as we in the civilian community respond favorably and accept those kind of assumptions, then they're going to be willing to go to the next stage, to the point where they're ultimately going to acknowledge that there is in fact another highly intelligent, highly technologically developed, but distinctly non-human civilization elsewhere in the universe first. They don't want to scare us by saying that it's right here in our own galaxy. But they'll discover one somewhere far off, and what they'll say is, yes, but of course, it's impossible for them to get here. So we don't have to be worried. But what we can do is we can communicate with them. Because it may take 20 years for a radio signal to get out to them, and 20 years for it to get back, but that's 40 years off, so you don't have to worry about it. That's how they're going to go through, I believe, this process. And but what that's going to be doing is ultimately they're going to be able to postpone, not only indefinitely, but indeed permanently, ever having to acknowledge that this last 65 years they've been lying to us, and that they've been deceiving us, and they've been concealing information, and they've been developing the technology that they've captured, etc. That they're never going to do that. You know, just like they still don't acknowledge that Israel has a nuclear weapon. And they just don't acknowledge it, though everybody knows it. Okay, and they don't take any real position that the W. Bush administration was torturing people. You know, why look back like that? As Obama says, let's just look forward. Let's make sure that doesn't happen anymore, but let's not try anybody or put them on trial for torturing people or something like that. That's not constructive. You know, let's not do any finger pointing or blaming people about things. Let's just go forward. And so I believe that's what they're going to be doing. Then what happened is, as predicted, in 2009, what happened is that the Vatican convened a colloquium of about 40 world scientists from around the world. And they brought them to the Vatican under the auspices of the Pontifical Academy of Science, and they actually held a week-long conference, and they came out, and then they issued from the Vatican press office an official statement saying that in light of the growing number of planets that are being discovered by the new space telescopes, it is becoming clear that sooner than later we're going to be encountering the existence of life elsewhere in the universe. And they went on to say that therefore the time has arrived when we should begin a very serious discussion of the profound philosophical and theological implications of the discovery of other life in the universe. Now, it's important to point out, they didn't say highly technologically developed, life in a civilization like ours. They said simple life. They're still trying to pretend that the pivot point is going to be discovering microbiotic life elsewhere in the universe. But the reality is that these profound philosophical and theological questions are probably not going to be confronted directly by the major mass population until such time as the discovery of an intelligent civilization actually exists. So what I did is I then made a presentation. I was invited in the new incarnation of the International UFO Congress when it was purchased by John Rao and moved to Scottsdale. I was invited in 2011 to make a speech in response to this announcement by the Vatican in my capacity as the former chief counsel for the Jesuits, and in light of the fact that I'd made this presentation at the International UFO Congress predicting that this was going to be happening. I was asked to begin this discussion. And so actually in that 2011 presentation, which you can get, it's available up on YouTube, or you can get it at openskiesministries.org. It's a 90-minute presentation in which I began to actually begin this discussion about what the philosophical and theological implications were of contact with an extraterrestrial civilization. Not simply with the discovery of life, but with the discovery of another highly intelligent, highly technologically developed, spacefaring, but non-human civilization. And I pointed out at length in that conversation, overlong, as I'm told, the distinctions between a mere philosophical question and a theological question, because they're not exactly the same. And so I began that discussion, and then I reached out and sent a message to the Vatican, to Father Jose Gabriel Funes, who is the Jesuit director of the Pontifical Observatory. It turns out he is the one that issued the call from the Vatican back in 2009, calling for us to begin this important discussion, this very serious discussion of the profound philosophical and theological questions that are posed by the discovery of life elsewhere in the universe. And I tried to get him to come to grips with not defining the trigger issue as the discovery of other microbiotic life, but to acknowledge that the real trigger point is going to be the discovery of another highly intelligent and highly technologically developed but non-human species. And I suggested to him that we might decide to establish a new paradigm institute. And I proposed that we establish that at the Graduate Theological Union at Berkeley, University of California at Berkeley in California, with the Graduate Theological Union, where there are 10 major theology schools of every one of the major religious denominations in the world are there, and that we establish an institute for the New Paradigm Institute, to undertake this serious discussion in a fully formalized and professional manner. The tasks of that New Paradigm Institute would be, first, to identify the specific philosophical and theological questions that would be posed by the discovery of another highly intelligent and highly technologically developed civilization, but also the public policy questions that would be raised by that, as to whether or not we should contact them, whether or not we should communicate to them what our state of technology is, whether we should attempt to invite them to come here if they're capable of doing it. There are a whole series of public policy questions that need to be addressed. The first task of such a New Paradigm Institute would be to identify discreetly these questions, the philosophical, theological, and public policy questions. The second objective of the New Paradigm Institute would be to provide answers to these philosophical, theological, and public policy questions. The third task of such a New Paradigm Institute would be to try to formulate a categorically distinct new human worldview that actually came to grips with the issue of human consciousness and what our relationship is in the universe, now that we have discovered that we are not only not located in the geographic physical center of the entire universe, which is what the whole debate was with Galileo and Copernicus, okay? But in fact, we discover that we're not even any longer at the apex of the pyramid of life in the universe. And that lo and behold, the universe was not created solely and exclusively for us, which, as it turns out, is an underlying presumption of every one of all 7 of the major presently operative human worldviews. So that we're looking at something entirely new here, an 8th paradigm worldview that takes into account the fact that there are other, not only other, but in fact hundreds of others, thousands of others, tens of thousands of others, billions of other, highly intelligent, highly technologically developed, but distinctly non-human civilizations elsewhere in our universe, many hundreds of which virtually certainly exist right here in our own Milky Way galaxy. So that is the third assignment of the New Paradigm Institute. I've come here today on November 12th of 2015 to announce to you that in fact the New Paradigm Institute has in fact now been established at the Graduate Theological Union. And I want to report to you the state of progress of that process. And I want to first context it very briefly in the context of where we are today. Here we are on November 13th of 2015, 2 weeks away from the major final summit conference that is going to be held in Paris on global climate change. That they've been going on for 21 years. They've been having these annual gatherings of all the governments in the world trying to come to grips with the issue that the pumping out of global greenhouse gases into our atmosphere is dramatically altering the climate of our entire planet. And they've been being fought off every single year by major transnational corporations who want to continue this process and to deny that the climate is being changed by their activities, and that they're getting ready to come to this major final global conference in Paris on November 28th, just 2 weeks from now. And they are going to be compelled at that meeting to come to a final determination as to what type of compulsory, legally enforceable standards are going to be imposed upon the major transnational corporations to stop them from destroying our climate. And yet, the House of Representatives of the United States, still dominated by extremely reactionary, very right-wing political forces in the Republican Party, are completely refusing to allow any type of mandatory agreement to be ratified. And in response to that, the Obama administration has proposed that they want to propose that the United States undertake a program, a voluntary program, of reducing by 33% the amount of annual global greenhouse gas emissions that are emitted by our corporations every single year, 33% below the 1995 levels of global greenhouse gas emissions. Whereas the International Panel on Climate Change of the United Nations, 2,000 global scientists, have stated that it's absolutely essential that we reduce by 70% the annual level of global greenhouse gas emissions every single year below the 1990 standard. And so the reality is that even the highest plan that's going to be proposed by the Obama administration is in fact only like 25% of the amount of reduction that has to be done in order to stop us from reaching the tipping point, to the point where the global climate change is going to be so dramatic that in fact the permafrost zones of our planet are going to begin to melt, and billions of tons of methane gas that has been captured beneath the permafrost zones from the decayed vegetation from billions of years ago is going to be released in major plumes into our atmosphere. And methane gas is 4 times more climate change oriented than is in fact carbon dioxide. And so that what we're faced with this challenge here. And as you know, when I was asked to speak at the Joshua Tree Contact in the Desert gathering, and I at that point in May of this year, I predicted that in fact Pope Francis was going to be issuing a papal encyclical in June of this year, in which he would in fact state finally and definitively that it is the position of the Roman Catholic social teachings that global climate change is in fact happening, that it is not in fact just part of some natural cycle on our planet. It's not being caused just by sunspots. That in fact the proximate causation of the major amounts of global climate change is in fact the activities of the transnational corporations. And I pointed out that he was going to say in that papal encyclical that in fact this was being caused knowingly by the corporations, and that they had to continue to rape and pillage the natural resources of the planet and transform them into products to be able to sell in order to maintain the profit levels that they needed to have to distribute the profits annually to their stockholders. And therefore, it was an intrinsic aspect of the transnational corporation that it had to continue this process. And therefore, they had to, in fact, have people consuming all of those new products, no matter how unnecessary they were. They had to generate a state of mind on the part of the people that, in fact, they were only valuable to the extent to which that of which they owned. That therefore, that they only what you could consume and conspicuously display was the evidence of your own self-worth. And so he pointed out, and I pointed out that he was going to say this, it turns out he did, that this is a function of a new worldview that is being foisted and promoted by the transnational corporations intentionally, consciously, okay, is being foisted upon people, the postmodern worldview, in which they disassemble every single positive conclusion of fact on the basis of which a person could conclude that they were of absolute value. That all we are is a simple, random combination of mass and energy that has happened to evolve the epiphenomenon of consciousness, and therefore there's no real ultimate source of value of us as beings other than what we have and what we possess and what we can conspicuously display to others. That is, in fact, a conscious worldview that is being formulated and promoted by the transnational corporate capitalists and their financial institutions. And this is what Pope Francis said in June of this year. And what he said is that it's important to understand that that is not true. That there is, in fact, another worldview, an alternative worldview that shows that we human beings are of real value. That we're not only of real value here on the planet, but we're of real value in the universe. And so what he's done is he's issued a call in his papal exhortation, which is called Evangelii Gaudium. He has called upon all of us to participate in formulating this new postmodern worldview. That he wants us to participate in this. And so therefore, it's extremely important to understand that Pope Francis has scheduled now on December 8th another major pronouncement he's going to be making. And the Paris Conference on Global Climate Change is going to go from November 28th to December 11th. And Pope Francis has scheduled a global announcement on December 8th. And by that time, he's going to know whether or not we have come to some sort of agreement to take positions that will, in fact, stop global climate change and reverse it and save our planet. And if they have not done that, I predicted at the Contact in the Desert, and I predicted again here today, that if in fact they do not come to some sort of meaningful, enforceable agreement, he is going to announce a Jubilee year. a Jubilee year in which all of the debt will be canceled, and that it will undermine the major transnational corporations and global financial system that is rooted in debt, that puts all of us into debt with our credit cards, with our loans, with the business loans, etc., and to make it clear that the Pope is going to take a position to stop this catastrophe that is happening on our planet. Now, therefore, what I want to do is I want to, in closing, just be able to report to you what the actual stages are that we are in now of the New Paradigm Institute, in which we are going to be responding both to the call of Father Fuentes and the others to try to identify a new human worldview that is going to answer the profound philosophical and theological and public policy questions that are going to be confronting us with the discovery of a new extraterrestrial civilization, but also a new worldview that is going to enable us as a species to value ourselves to an extent to which we do not have to rely upon consuming the material goods of the transnational corporate system, so that we can in fact see that we're of value and we can share this value with our extraterrestrial neighbors. And so that in closing, in the last 5 minutes, I just want to tell you that number one, I have just come back from Rome last Tuesday. Just come back from Rome, and I've been meeting with Father Fuentes directly. And Father Fuentes has agreed to take a leave of absence as his position from the director of the Papal Observatory. And he's going to be doing a sabbatical at the Jesuit School of Theology at Berkeley in California. And he has agreed to participate with us in the New Paradigm Institute there in chairing and hosting this major serious discussion. And we're going to be inviting world leaders from all around the world in the areas of all of the sciences and all of the spiritual traditions and the philosophical traditions. We're going to come together and we're going to hold these discussions looking into answering these, first identifying and then answering these philosophical, theological, and public policy questions. Secondly, our Romero Institute, our 501c3 organization, which is the progeny of the Christic Institute that Bob mentioned we founded, has established this New Paradigm Institute. It has offices now at 2040 Bancroft Way at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California. We have a commitment of $1 million from one of the major co-producers of Live Aid to $1 million to purchase a permanent facility there at the Graduate Theological Union. We have a commitment of another $1 million to pay for the out-of-pocket costs of bringing together the world experts together and sitting in conference together and vetting them all. We're going to be going through a process from January 1st of this next year to September 1st of next year, vetting all of hundreds of these different potential participants in these discussions. And then starting on September 1st, we're going to be having a whole series of a year-long set of discussions to answer these profound questions. And I have an agreement from our board of directors to establish an independent, not 501c3, but a Section 6033 organization, an independent, spiritual, voluntary membership association, which is going to be the parent of this New Paradigm Institute. And we've compiled a list of 100 world experts as of now that we're going to be vetting during this process. And I've secured an agreement from Father Fuentes, as I said, that he will in fact participate in chairing and hosting these gatherings, following up on the official announcement made by the Vatican in 2009 that the time has arrived for this serious discussion. And so that raises the question that I want to address just in closing is, what do we think the nature of this new paradigm worldview is going to be? Now, that's part of the reason we're gathered here together, to start to discuss this process. It reminds me of an event that I had back in 1972. I was sitting with my roommates in New York City, and we were having a discussion about all these new dramatic technological devices that were being developed with the cell phones and internet and all the things that were happening. We were saying, just think, in another 100 years, they're going to have developed technologies that we're not even conceivably able to imagine at this point. At which point, one of the people in the thing said, like what? So that's sort of the situation that we're in right now. What I'm saying is that this new eighth paradigm worldview is going to be something that it's virtually impossible for us to imagine at this point in time as to what it's going to be. It's not going to be just some mere extension of previous worldviews that we have, these 7 different worldviews that we have, that it's going to be a brand new worldview. And it's going to be undertaken similar to the way the Native American people gather together in a circle, the leaders, and they each offer into the center, into the basket, their perspective on a given issue. And then what happens is they go around the circle until a new and completely different insight arises out of the community that gathered in circle. And that insight is going to be the answer to the question. So that is the process that we're beginning now at the New Paradigm Institute. I invite you, all of you, to send to us your proposals as to what you think such a new paradigm worldview should be. You send it to me. It's at newparadigminstitute.org. Very simple. newparadigminstitute.org. Send me your offerings, whether you've gotten them in a dream, whether you've gotten them through just a logical, scientific extrapolation upon data that you have, whether or not it came to you in a dream, a meditation, whether you've had conversations with an ET being that this comes from, whatever the source of these are, send those to us, because I am going to be participating in helping to chair these discussions with the world experts, spiritual experts, philosophy experts, theology experts, scientific experts in the realm of quantum physics, consciousness, people who've had experiences with ETs and UFOs, etc., and that I will insert into this discussion your proffers so that we can have all of these different ideas up in front of us at the same time. So I'm inviting you to participate in the New Paradigm Institute, to participate in this dialogue that's got to go on. This is the beginning of the serious discussion. We've gotten past the point of arguing with people about whether extraterrestrial beings exist. We've gotten past that phase of this movement where we're arguing that we ought to get the United States to stop the cover-up. We've gotten past the stage where we think the United States Congress is going to muster the courage to reveal all this to us. We've gotten to the stage now where we've now become grown-ups. We've now become grown-ups in this movement, and we now understand that this is true, and we need to start demonstrating, not only to each other and to our fellow human beings, but to the extraterrestrial beings, that we, in fact, are prepared to identify a human worldview that prepares us to become full citizens in this galactic community. So I invite you to participate. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Hey, thank you. Daniel Sheehan, everybody.